Once again, welcome to ITSE 1345. This is Chapter 5. It deals with procedures. Procedures is one of the core elements that we're going to look at because that builds the holding mechanism for everything that's actually going to do the work. The procedure also is that process that will be embedded in other areas, but the procedure itself is where most of the work is done. Now, the procedure itself is a program, and we're going to create that as a sub-program that will be used in other areas. Because a program usually houses sub-programs. Understand that the procedure is a program. The procedure can be used as a sub-program in other areas. So that's that layered effect. Now, since we're going to create a program, every program needs to have a name. So, like with anything, there's a structure that we will look at, the syntax structure, to create this tool. So it starts with create or replace, and then you have the procedure. You have to tell it what it's doing, and then you give it the name. Now, the reason you do the or replace is if you have multiple programmers or whatever, you really don't know if someone created another program, another procedure, and by happenstance wound up with the same name. There is a slim possibility that if there's another sub-program procedure with the same name, you could have problems. So it's a good practice just to use or replace. So what you do is you do the create the procedure, you give it a name or replace, and then right after that is where you start listing. This is where you list the parameters that you're going to use. You also have to tell it the type of the data that you're going to be using. There's also the syntax that you have to use. It is as. Now, the is as, this is one of those preference issues. Is as, and there's some debate as to the proper or which one is used better off. For the purposes of this class, it's not that significant. But later on, as you work into a business environment, every programming environment, every employer has their own business rules, practices. So you would have to kind of figure out what their preference is to use. Okay, after that, once again, you start with the begin. Now the begin, this is where you have the executable. Now the executable, most of the time, is where you do the select from where. And that's where you do the extracting data. And then this is where the actual event happens, where you do the analysis of comparatives. This is where you do the else if or whatever. Once you do that, you always have the exception and then the end. Now, in the exception part of the procedure, you have to consider whether or not the issue that you're having problems with is a normal item or not. Going back to that cursor event where you had the bad data, the 0 and the O, and you want to just have a printout of that bad piece of data, the exception here kind of builds on that. But not only does it tell you that you have bad data, but there's also a mechanism that you can build that will say where to go or what to do when something goes wrong, more than just print out what the mistake is. So one of the things that you will look at in building the procedure is that added issue with the exception where you also have to build a mechanism that will take action as opposed to just printing out some bad data. Now, the parameters. When you're bringing information in, and going back to that cursor where you're transporting information in and out, part of the process that you're doing is you're going to tell the cursor that I'm going to bring data in, but you don't have to return it. I'm going to bring data in, and then you have to return the same value. I'm going to bring data in, but the value return is different from the one that I gave you. So there is an in-out mechanism that you also have to develop with this process that says, by the way, I'm going to bring something in, I'm going to do some calculations, but what I give you back is not going to be the same thing. Or yes, I'm going to bring in the same thing, and I want the same thing back. So there's that mechanism that you have to create. There's also a generic understanding that above the begin statement, this is called the header, and then after the begin, this is called the body. Now, this idea of header and body is not as prevalent in this process, but understand that as you develop this, this is information, this is where the executable. It is possible later on to parse this out and use the header for something else and use the body for something else, because they're actually two logical units. So as we go through this class, you will learn that there is the body and the header concept that is also prevalent in this whole thing. But let me give you an example on that. Going back to that payroll system that we had at the very beginning. As we're bringing information in, remember we're going to have the employee and you're going to have the hourly rate, stuff like that. So you're going to have some constant values that you bring in. So you'll have some constant values. Now, we had that $10 and $10.40 to give you the 400. Now that 400 will be used in the retirement, will be used in the insurance, and will be used in the FICA, right? So you can have the same header stuff here where you'll have the same values, but then in the body, depending on where you use, you can have it's kind of an interchangeable thing. So this is one of the values and tools that we need to use. Some people aren't as comfortable with it, but it is a capability that you can use. So we have the procedure name, the actual syntax. You have the idea that you are creating a sub-program. You have the parameters, because these are the placeholders that are going to hold all the data that you're using. You have to tell it the data type that you're going to be using. You also have to inform the process whether this is a one-way, two-way scenario, and whether it's the same data or not the same data. You have to develop the execution process where you actually do the select from where. You have the exception handler, where this is where you can either do the just print out that you had a mistake, or where you can actually tell it that where to go or what to do scenario. The other thing is that when you're working in this process here in the executable, when you're doing stuff, remember I told you about the interchangeability where you could call it, where you can have this and this. Down here, you can also use this process to call another process to help you. So in here, you can go out and call another procedure to give you some assistance. And that reduces the need to do a lot of program. Because remember, you have a program, you give it a name. This is a tool. And it goes back to the socket and the ratchet and the extension. Now, if you're doing this and you need to reach for the extension to give you more reach, that's where in the executable, you can go out and pick that other program that's going to come back and help you, which is like adding the extension to the socket and the wrench to give you more flexibility. So once again, you have the header, you have the body, you have the construct of the syntax, you have the parameters that are going to hold the information, you have the type of data you're going to be using, you have to tell it as is, the executable process, the exception. I think that about concludes this issue on procedure.